All right, so 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 11 is where we're at. We're going to break this down a little bit like we typically do. So let's look at verses 11 and 12 of 1 Peter chapter 2. We'll read that and then we'll spend some time talking about it. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. These two particular verses talk about Christian conduct among non-believers, but they are also going to set the stage for a whole chunk of material that's going to follow in the part of chapter 2 that we're looking at this morning, and also chapter 3 on Wednesday night. Okay, these verses here kind of provide that introduction to this larger section in the book. Peter's following comments, okay, are now based on the Christian status as sojourner and exile. There are two terms that are used there, not citizens. Go ahead and take your Bibles, hold your spot there in 1 Peter chapter 2, but let's look over in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 20. Philippians chapter 3 and verse 20, Paul talks about where the Christian citizenship is. And in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 20, he says, but our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. So this idea of citizenship and where we're citizens, this idea of being exiles and sojourners is nothing unique to Peter, and it's not new. We see that elsewhere in the Scriptures. Paul uses that terminology as well, and we could look at some other verses, but we won't for the sake of time. The two words that Peter uses here, he uses the word sojourner. Sojourner is a word that refers to somebody who is living in a foreign country without citizenship. In our legal terminology, we would call these folks resident aliens, okay? And of course, we're not talking about people from outer space. Resident aliens. They're people who have moved to a country. They're still technically foreigners. They don't have citizenship. When Ivana and I first moved here, Ivana was a resident alien of the United States because she didn't have citizenship immediately. And when we lived in the Czech Republic, she didn't have any residency status in the United States because we were living there. At the same time, I was a resident alien in the Czech Republic, but without citizenship. So Ivana and I can both kind of relate to this term of being sojourners, okay? She was a sojourner for a little while here until she became a citizen. I was a sojourner over there. I never became a citizen of the Czech Republic. So one of the words he uses is sojourner. The other word that he uses is the word exile. The word exile refers to one who lives only temporarily in a given place, or a temporary resident, if you will. When the war in Ukraine started, a whole lot of folks from Ukraine went to places like Poland and Slovakia, the Czech Republic, even right here in Dallas-Fort Worth. We have a small population of people who have fled the war from Ukraine. They are people who are here temporarily. When the war over there ends, a lot of those folks will go back to the country they came from. They did not intend to immigrate somewhere else. They are just here as exiles. And some of those folks actually, because so much of the war now is being fought in the eastern part of the country, a lot of those folks have actually already gone back to Ukraine. So we get sojourner and exile. You might note in looking at this, and we're not going to look at the passage, but you've got it in your notes, that in Genesis chapter 23 and verse 4, we have the exact same terminology in the Septuagint, okay? Remember, the Septuagint is the Old Testament translated into Greek, and that Greek version of Genesis chapter 23 and verse 4 uses the exact same terminology that Peter uses here in verse 11. I got to go back to look at it, whether it's verse 11 or verse 12. Verse 11, okay? The exact same terminology. Remembering that about probably a little more than half of the times that the New Testament quotes or alludes to the Old Testament, it's to the Septuagint. It's to the Greek translation of the Old Testament, not to the Hebrew. That was what most Jews in the first century were using because they no longer could read Hebrew, but they could read Greek, okay? So there's a kind of a going back to that. So when Peter uses that terminology, his Jewish recipients of this letter, and they were certainly not all Jewish, but as Jewish recipients of this letter would have probably associated that with what is said about Abraham in Genesis chapter 23 and verse 4. Harkrider says this in looking at these words in his book, in his workbook. He says, both words remind us that our stay on earth is brief. Okay, that this is truly not our home. We used to have a lot of songs that we sang in our book. We still sing some of them about the fact that this world is not our home. Sometimes we get very, very comfortable in this world and we forget this world is not our home. We should be looking to the country in which we are really citizens. And where is that? Philippians 3 and verse 20. Where is our citizenship? Philippians 3 and verse 20. See, I gotcha. I went back to that verse that we looked at. It's in heaven, okay? Our citizenship is in heaven. We are citizens of the kingdom of heaven, okay? Based on these things, Peter is saying, it's going to have an effect on our conduct. So he tells them that Christians should abstain from the quote-unquote passions of the flesh, which wage war against the soul. I've given you some references here. Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 through 21. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 21 through 24. Also Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 18, that talk about the fact that there is a spiritual war going on. Let's look at one of these. Let's go to Galatians chapter 5 and verse 19. Galatians 5 and 19. Again, hold your spot there in 1 Peter. We're going to go back to it. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 19, Paul talks about these passions of the flesh that wage war against us. He says, now the works of the flesh are evident. And he gives us a listing: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. You look at that list, and if you're going down that list and thinking, well, there's a lot of stuff on that list, I can assure you that almost every sin that people engage in today is going to fit somewhere in a list like that. Okay, some of these terms are broad enough to include a lot of things that are not directly stated in the text. The warfare is spiritual. Let's look at another verse. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6, starting in verse 10. We're going to read down to 18. Ephesians 6, starting in verse 10. Paul says this. He says, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Let me just make a stop right there and say this. When Paul is listing the forces that we fight against in this warfare, where are they? We point up, okay, as in towards heaven, but let's point up differently, towards the spiritual realm. That's where these enemies are found, in the spiritual realm, okay? He says very bluntly that we do not fight against flesh and blood. The real war is the war that takes place behind the scenes. If you've been in my Revelation class, you know that I emphasize that what the book of Revelation does, it kind of pulls a Wizard of Oz thing for us. Remember the movie, The Wizard of Oz? The little wizard, he's got this big thing that he's scaring everybody with, and Toto comes and pulls the curtain back, and there's this little guy back there controlling everything. That's pulling the curtain back. That's what the book of Revelation does. That's what Paul does here as well. That's who we're really up against, okay? Not flesh and blood. So then he continues on, and you know this text. He says, therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand firm. Stand therefore, having fastened on, and here we get the armor, the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith. We get the picture without having to read the text. The armor that's given there is all spiritual in nature. What Paul does not say is he does not say, go down to the local sword shop, and buy the latest and greatest 6-shot sword that you can find so that you can wage this warfare. Warfare for the Christian is spiritual, okay? So Christians should abstain from the passions of the flesh. Well, let's go back to 1 Peter and just note some other things here. 1 Peter, we're still in verses 11 and 12. Peter then talks about what I'm simply going to call the Christian's evangelistic lifestyle. And like I said, he's going to spend a lot of time talking about this in the remainder of chapter 2 and also in chapter 3, that evangelistic lifestyle. Let me say that differently. There is, in looking at how Christians are accused of living, there is a disconnect between accusations. The accusations against Christians is that they are evildoers, and the reality of how Christians are to conduct themselves is that they are to have honorable conduct, good deeds, if you will. So what Peter is saying here is Christians are accused of a lot of things, and indeed they were in the first century. They were accused of a lot of immorality, believe it or not. We would usually think of the world around the church as being immoral, but the accusations against Christians were that they were the ones that were practicing immorality and they were disloyal and things like that. We're going to talk about all of those. Peter says you need to make sure as disciples of Jesus that you are living in such a way that they will realize that the accusations are incorrect. We need to remember that if we as disciples live like the world around us, engage in the things that the world around us engages in, people aren't going to take Christianity seriously. So Peter says, by your conduct, demonstrate who you follow. By your conduct, demonstrate that these accusations are false. Then we get this phrase at the very end of verse 12, and you may have seen this as you were reading through and kind of wondering about that. He tells them that when these Gentiles see that conduct, they will glorify God on the day of visitation. I'm just going to throw this idea out here without getting into a long discussion of it, that I think that what Peter is saying there is that Gentiles that observe the conduct of Christians and themselves become Christians will be able to glorify God on the day of visitation. It may be a reference there to the final judgment. It may be a reference to the fact there that they accept the gospel of Christ. The end result is going to be the same. Okay? People, when they watch how we live and watch what we do, they will understand that we live differently, by a different code, if you will, by a different set of standards. And if then people are prompted by that to talk to us about Jesus, and they themselves become Christians, then they will have very good reason to glorify God. Sometimes, and I understand that the 2024 theme here for the congregation is going to be evangelism. I've talked about that last Sunday in the pulpit. There's going to be more about that coming. Sometimes when we talk about evangelism, sometimes what we think about of evangelism is, I go up to somebody like Tim, you just don't sit this close to me or I'll use you every single time. You go up to somebody like Tim and you say, hey, Tim, would you like to have a Bible study? And Tim kind of looks at me and says, man, I hardly know you. And you're asking me a question like that? Whereas if I live in such a way that Tim says, there's something different about this guy, then there is a door that is opened to talking about the gospel. Sometimes our idea of evangelism, it's always got to be, oh, I'm going to go up, hey, let's have a Bible study. The reality is that a lot of people, that's a mental block for a lot of people. Because the idea of going up to someone and saying, hey, let's sit down and study the Bible together, people are afraid of that, okay? I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I suspect that if I asked for a show of hands, I'd see a lot of hands. That a lot of folks are afraid to do that, to go up to somebody. But how we live is evangelism as well. And Peter is going to spend some time talking about three groups that we're going to get to. I promise we will. Wherein conduct is going to provide a good basis for evangelism. Okay, believe it or not, I'm not yet done with these verses. Okay, so let's look at these groups. There are some accusations that are leveled against Christians. One of those is that Christians were not submitting to rulers. They were subversives. We would look at that and we'd say, well, that's really strange, but Christians in the first century were viewed as disloyal to the Roman state. because they wouldn't do some things that most other Roman citizens would. They would not go into the temples and offer prayers to the pagan gods on behalf of the Roman Empire. They would not worship the emperor. And so Christians were accused of being disloyal. Peter's going to address that in chapter 2. Also, an accusation that was leveled against disciples that the slaves were not submitting. We can understand how that would be true too, couldn't we? If a master requires a slave to do something that violates God's law, the slave isn't going to do that. And so, well, boy, you're not a very loyal slave. And by the way, if you're a slave and you refuse to obey your master, what would happen to you in the ancient world? You would get beaten. Okay, there would be some real penalties, real earthly penalties. Okay, so these are very much real questions for disciples. There was also the accusation that was made that wives were not submitting. And so those are the three groups. They're all going to be addressed in chapter 2 and chapter 3. But the context is conduct among non-believers. Black says this. He says, those who live their lives in opposition to the prevailing culture pay a price. Since we have our high school students here, I will address them directly because they're young and they're in a different place in their lives. If you live your lives, young people, in opposition to the prevailing culture, you will pay a price. It may be that there are some people that will have nothing to do with you. It may be that you have to forego some opportunities in life. It may be that you have to forego some activities in life. There will be a price to pay. It isn't that older people don't pay that price. We certainly do. But we've had decades more to get used to paying that price, and so it doesn't surprise us a whole lot. If you go against the prevailing culture, there is a price that will be paid. All right, let's continue on. Those were the first two verses. We've still got several more to address this morning. Let's look at verses 13 through 17. Peter addresses the first group that was in that chart. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. All right, so this text here, these verses that we looked at, and boy, Caleb, I'm going to be really surprised if during this discussion you don't get to walk around some with that mic so we have some comments and questions about this. I hope that we will. Just raise your hand if you do, and he will come to you with the mic, okay? This section talks about the Christian and civil government. There are several New Testament texts elsewhere that address this issue. Romans chapter 13 is the one we probably usually think of. Romans chapter 13 verses 1 through 7. Matthew chapter 17 verse 24. Matthew chapter 22 verses 17 through 21. Also Acts chapter 5 and verse 29. Now, I'm not going to look at all of those verses. We simply don't have time. We are going to look at Acts chapter 5 and verse 29 in just a moment. But before we do that, I'm going to kind of give you the paraphrase of what these verses are about. Romans 13 verses 1 through 7 is very much a parallel to our text here in 1 Peter. Matthew chapter 17, Matthew chapter 22, Peter's addressing specific issues there concerning, anybody know off the top of their heads? What does Jesus address when he's here on the earth? He gets some specific questions about taxes. Good. He gets specific questions about taxes. Jesus addresses that. Do we as Christians have to pay tax? Yes, we do. Okay. Whatever tax is required of us. All right. We can use whatever rules our IRS has set up. We don't have to pay taxes on things that we don't have to pay taxes on. But if we're legally required to pay taxes, we're supposed to pay taxes. So our income tax returns should be what? They should be accurate. They should be complete. We should not fudge the numbers because you don't want to go to jail, right? Wrong. They should be accurate and complete because God tells you to. Jail is nothing. Jail's temporary. Hell is eternal. Okay? We as Christians have an obligation to pay our taxes. Again, Romans chapter 13 is very much parallel to 1 Peter here, 1 Peter chapter 2. But let's go ahead and look at Acts chapter 5 and verse 29, because this verse is important for understanding the instructions then that Peter gives to these groups. Acts chapter 5 and verse 29. But Peter and the apostles answered. They'd been told not to preach about Jesus. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than man. So the principle that's given here in Acts chapter 5 and verse 29, it's very important for us as Christians to understand, is that when it comes down to either obeying God or obeying civil authority, who do we obey? We obey God. All right? So if the government gives us an order that would require us to disobey God, who do we obey? We obey God. We don't obey the government. Okay? If the government tells us we can't do some things, if the government says you can't preach on homosexuality, it's a hate crime. Does that sound so far-fetched to you? That is already the situation in Canada. Okay? That is already the situation in Canada. The Canadian government has made it a hate crime. And religious folks in Canada have run afoul of the law because they have preached against homosexuality from the Scriptures. If the government does that, so do I need to put homosexuality on the list of things I will never address from the pulpit? Absolutely not. I've made the statement here at Beach, some of y'all have heard that if tomorrow the government says it's a hate crime to preach what the Bible says about homosexuality, you can bet you know what you're going to hear about Sunday morning. And I hope some of y'all will come visit me in prison or help pay my legal bills or whatever. All right? Because I would be in a situation where the government's telling me not to do what God has commanded because it's a part of the counsel of God. Okay, am I going to preach on it every Sunday? No, because we're supposed to preach the whole counsel of God. All right? But I'm sorry? You'll be sure I get my coffee. They probably won't let you take that in. They'll probably think you're smuggling me something, or I don't know. Acts chapter 5 and verse 29 is important. It's important when we look at the text here in verses 13 through 17. It's important when we look at the text concerning servants. It's important when we look at the text concerning wives. That principle underlies everything. We obey God rather than man. But we also need to remember that most of the time, that isn't the issue. Okay? If the state of Texas requires me to inspect and pay a road tax on my car, registration, I can't go to the state of Texas and say, oh, that violates God's law. No, it doesn't. So we need to obey the laws of the land. All right? Fidelity, Harkrider says, fidelity to Christ, faithfulness to Christ, if you will, is shown by obeying the laws of the land. So when people accuse Christians of being disobedient, let's show them that's not accurate. In the days of Rome, that was important. Because when the Roman government, not many years after these words are penned, are going to require Christians to go into the pagan temple and offer sacrifice to the emperor and get a certificate saying they had done that, Christians aren't going to do that. But they're going to be loyal in every other aspect of their lives. Okay? Human institution here. He uses some terminology. We should just note this. Human institution, emperor, governors, make it clear that it is government across the board. Okay? So we have to obey the president. We have to obey the laws passed by Congress. We have to obey the governor, whether you like him or not. It doesn't matter what political party he's from. We have to obey the governor. Who else do we have to obey? Right on down the list. So we have to obey the mayor. Okay, if there are laws and rules in the city of Fort Worth, we have to obey those as well. So it's across the board. It's not just the very top. It's not just the President of the United States. It's all the other things because the governors are appointed by the emperor. Human institutions are those institutions that are set up to make governance work. Doesn't matter whether we live in a monarchy, a democracy, or a totalitarian regime. What was the government of the Roman Empire? It was a monarchy. You had an emperor. Okay, what else was it? It was a totalitarian regime. In fact, if you remember from the introduction to this class, how does Peter die? Peter dies because of an angry mob in the city of Rome, right? No. Peter dies as a martyr at the hands of the Roman government in the city of Rome, not many years after he pens these words. Do you think it made a difference to Peter? It did not. Okay? It doesn't matter what government we live under, we are responsible to follow what Peter and what Paul in the other verses and what Jesus himself has told us. All right. Proper respect and obedience, and that's the point of this, okay? Behavior, evangelism based in behavior. Proper respect and obedience will make it clear that pagan accusations were based in ignorance and foolishness. Across the long history of Roman persecution of Christians, the accusations would have no foundation in fact. So the Roman government comes along and says, Tim, see, I'm going to get you to move off this pew because you're not going to like sitting up here. Tim, you go into the temple and you offer sacrifice to the emperor to prove you're a loyal citizen. Well, Tim's not going to do that because it violates God's law. So since they already think I'm a disloyal citizen, I'm going to get a band of guys together and we're going to start robbing people on the highway, right? Can any of you picture Tim as a highway robber? I can't, okay? No. You can't do that thing that the government requires. So because of that, you've got to make doubly sure that you are crossing all your T's and dotting your I's and living as you're supposed to where the law doesn't conflict. So that people will understand. Then he tells them here at the end of the passage that Christian freedom should not be used as an excuse to disobey civil rulers needlessly. Okay? When it's an Acts chapter 5 verse 29 issue, we have to disobey. The rest of the time, we need to obey the government. All right? It's not quite done yet. Black says this about this particular turn of phrase that Peter uses. He says the Christians of Asia Minor, these are the Christians that are receiving this letter first, okay? The Christians of Asia Minor have been set free from human rulers by acceptance of another ruler. But that ruler wants them to submit to human rulers insofar as they do not demand disobedience to his will. They must not use their Christian freedom as a quote-unquote cover-up, literally a veil. The word there is epikalima, for doing evil. Okay? Don't use your freedom as a veil. I like that terminology. 5 years ago, if you had walked into a bank in the state of Texas wearing a face mask, what would the assumption have been? You were there to rob the place, okay? And then we had the pandemic and everybody's wearing face masks. And you go into a bank and everybody's wearing face masks. And then after the pandemic, when a lot of folks quit wearing face masks, I know some still do, and when they're sick, they do. If I were sick, I would wear one, okay? People, by and large, are not wearing face masks. So now what if some of the criminals decided to do? Wear face masks while they're committing their crimes because it gives them an opportunity to do that. Peter says, do not use your freedom as a cover-up, a veil for disobedience, okay, or for doing evil. There are 4 short rules, then, that sum up Christian responsibilities to others at the very last verse, verse 17. The rule, honor everyone, okay? Rule number 1, honor everyone. We need to be careful how we interact with other people. We need to show respect and honor. I've given you some verses there on the side. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. Romans chapter 12, let's just think about that passage there in Genesis 1. Let's go over there and look at that. Again, I give you a lot of references to study on your own at home. We can't look at all of these. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, all the way back at the creation. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the flesh of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Every human being who has ever lived on this earth, who lives on this earth, and will live on this earth, bears the image of God. And so when Peter talks about honoring everyone, we honor everyone because everyone is created in the image of God. Unless there be any mistake, Genesis 1:27 makes it very clear that it is both male and female who bear the image of God. Okay? So in our interactions with other people, we should remember that we honor everyone. Okay? Does it mean we can never disagree with other people? Raise your hand if it means we can never disagree with other people. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. Good. Does it mean we can never have an argument with other people? No. But it means we need to be careful how we do that our attitude shows, in effect, honor and respect towards others. We respect people for who they are as image bearers of God. Then he says, rule number 2, love the brotherhood. Okay? That's about that relationship that occurs within Christians. Okay, you can look at John 13, 34 and 35, but we get the gist. When we love the brotherhood, when we demonstrate love among ourselves in a world that doesn't demonstrate a whole lot of that, do you think the world takes notice? I'm sorry, I'm going to use John and David over here. I hope you don't mind. John and David, African American and white, sitting on the pew together. Now, I know our society has changed a lot, but it hadn't changed that much. And here, I'll use Tim and Flora over here. Here we go. A mixed race marriage. Tim remembers a day, I know you're old enough to remember a day, when you didn't see that very much. It was frowned upon, not just in the South, everywhere. And here in this church, do we care what color people are? I hope not. Do we care about where people come from? I hope not, as I look at my Czech-born wife over there, my import. She just stuck her tongue out at me. You didn't see that. And it's not on the camera either, so there. All right? Of course not. And we've got other folks that are mixed couples as well. And from all over the world. I'm not even sure how many countries we have represented here at North Beach right now. I'd have to do a quick count, but I would say about 5 or 6 people that have either immigrated directly here or people whose origins, all right, maybe parents came from a foreign country. Love the brotherhood. Show the world we're different. Show the world we're not like everyone else. People will take notice. Rule number 3, fear God. That makes sense. We all understand that, right? Fear God. Remember who God is. Remember who we are. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7. Let's look at this. You can almost know what it's going to say before I even read it. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And you could multiply other verses that talk about that as well. And then finally, the 4th rule, honor the emperor. It's given here in this text and the others that we looked at, okay? We as Christians need to be careful. We as Christians in America need to be careful because we have unbelievable rights, okay? Do you know what happens if you go to Thailand and you speak evil of the king of Thailand? I'm not sure they call him a king. I'm not sure what, the ruler of Thailand, okay? He's not an emperor, so I'm a king. What happens if you go to Thailand and you publish a letter to the editor in the newspaper where you criticize the king of Thailand? You go to jail, okay? I remember it wasn't that many years ago that some teenagers went to Singapore and they were chewing gum in public or something, and what was their punishment? Do anybody remember? They got caned for that, okay? So we don't live under those kind of governments. As Americans, we're pretty used to being able to say whatever we want, whenever we want, however we want. And if you don't cross a certain legal line, you're not going to get in trouble. Okay? You yell fire in a crowded movie theater, you're going to get in trouble. Okay? That's not protected speech. But almost everything else is. So I can write a terrible scathing article about Biden and say everything I think about him and everything he's doing wrong. And I can do the same thing about Trump. And am I going to go to jail about that? No, not unless I make a threat, and then I'm going to get visited by the Secret Service, and then I might go to jail. And Tim probably wouldn't visit me because I should be in jail. Okay, I broke the law, all right? But we have a tendency as Christians to be very free with our mouths in America. We need to be careful. We need to be careful, okay, that we are honoring the emperor, regardless of who he or she may be, and regardless of what political party he or she may be from. All right, that's 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. I got like 9 minutes to get the next section. So we're going to talk about that, 18 through 25. We're going to read it. Go back to 1 Peter, if you will. Let's see, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18 through 25. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. So, second group that Peter addresses in this text, these texts on behavior evangelism, okay, are Christian servants and slaves. And again, it emphasizes the need to eliminate this accusation as well through proper behavior. Slavery in the Roman Empire was widespread. I think I said recently in a class it was like 50% because I had heard that somewhere. That's not accurate, okay, so I'm correcting that now. Best guess is that estimates will go anywhere from 10 to 20% of the population of the Roman Empire as a whole were slaves. They were slaves in the same sense of the word that African Americans were kept as slaves in this country in the past. Owners had absolute power over other human beings who were viewed as their property. And it was anywhere from 10 to 20% of the population. Okay, that was Roman reality. Among Christians, that was probably a higher percentage because Christians mostly came from the lower classes of society, including the slave classes, or the slave class, if you will. So a lot of Christians were slaves. You can see how that would be a difficulty for them because if the master wanted them to do something that was illegal, they refused to do it. The master could punish them and treat them, for the most part, any way they wanted. There were some very minor legal protections, but the reality in the Roman Empire was no one really cared about those things anyways. So if you wanted to kill your slave, well, you'd do that, and you'd get away with it, because nobody was going to punish you for that. It wasn't any different than if you didn't like your dog anymore, and you killed your dog. Okay? It was the same thing. And so this was the reality for a lot of people. Slavery in the Roman Empire was not based on ethnicity, but it was based on other factors. So war captives were enslaved. Birth to slaves, if you were born to a slave mother, you were a slave. It was also based on economic. People sold themselves into slavery. It could also be based in infant abandonment because guess what? The same society that says slaves have no rights also said children have no rights. So if when a child was born, the father said, nope, I don't want him. Where did that child go? Out on the streets. Didn't matter what the mother wanted. What mattered was the father. Okay? Or if the child was deformed, or, ladies, you'll really appreciate this, what's more valuable, male babies or female babies? Male babies, okay? In a society like the Roman Empire, male babies were more valuable, and so female babies were abandoned. Many times, those infants were adopted into slavery, Okay, piracy also was a reality. So there were lots of ways you could end up being a slave. Majority of Christians came from the lower classes of society. That doesn't mean the majority were slaves, but they came from those classes of society. There were some wealthy Christians as well, Lydia, Phoebe, Erastus, others that are mentioned in the scripture. So it wasn't that all Christians were poor, but a lot of them were. Okay. Paul also addresses this relationship in Ephesians chapter 6, also Colossians chapter 3, a couple of passages that look at these, and there's some parallels with those as well. Obedience to masters, Peter tells his readers, was not based on their goodness or their injustice. It was based upon obeying God. Okay, so bad masters, still got to obey them. Good masters, still got to obey them. Okay, the implication here in verse 19 is that the suffering the slave is enduring has some relation to obedience to God. Slaves might deviate from their master's command in order to obey the master in heaven. So my master tells me to kill an infant. What am I going to do? I'm not going to kill the infant. Okay, I'm going to obey God first. All right, so I'm sorry, I should have pulled that up, but I didn't do it. Again, we have the phrase in 19 and 20. It's a gracious thing. Combined with verse 20, the word credit seem to indicate that Peter has in mind God's reward. Okay, we earn credit, if you will, with God when we suffer for the right reasons. It doesn't mean that we are saved by having a long list of works that we've done, but it does mean that we earn credit, if you will, in that way with God. Okay, God recognizes that. Ultimately, Peter says, the Christian's response is tied to Jesus' example. Jesus always had it easy, right? Peter reminds them that Jesus was sinless and he suffered anyways. Jesus was sinless, disciples are not. Jesus was not deceitful, disciples often are, because we sin. Jesus did not retaliate, disciples often do. Jesus is still the example for how we should behave. Jesus entrusted himself to God, as should disciples, ultimately, even to the cross, which enabled disciples to die to sin and live to righteousness. You look to Jesus as the example. Brothers and sisters, that example tells us how we should behave in the circumstances that we're in. Peter then reminds his readers again that Jesus' deeds enabled their salvation, our salvation. Therefore, his example is powerful and binding on all disciples, whether they are slave or free, or slave and free. I'll say it that way. Okay? That is 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 through 25.